Before we get going here, Eric, I really wanted to tell you a joke about time travel, but unfortunately you didn't find it very funny. I'm so sorry, everybody. Oh my God. Hey folks, welcome to What Magic Is This? It's a podcast that wishes to remind you that time doesn't exist, but clocks do. My name is Douglas Batchelor, and on this show we're going to be talking about magic, the occult, the esoteric, the supernatural, the paranormal, and the weird. Now, I don't know if this comes as a surprise to anybody listening to the show. My next guest is somebody who I talk about their work, specifically one book, numerous times on this show. And for the month of December, I decided I wanted to reach out to people that I've always wanted to talk to. No surprise that I had to ask the author, the blogger of perhaps one of the greatest blogs, if not the greatest blog that has been out in the last 10 years, and a fellow Monty Python enthusiast, Dr. Eric Wargo. Eric, how's your year going? How's your 2020?
2020 sucks, Douglas. It is the worst fucking year.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm the only one to say that.
You know, I don't think that you're alone there.
No, actually, that's not true. 2020 has actually ended up being very good to me.
Yeah.
I have a new baby daughter who is awesome, and that,
Wonderful.
It doesn't get better than that, but it has been absolutely brutal in every other respect of my life.
I think 2020 is one of those years that we're never going to forget it, truthfully. I mean, for somebody like you and I who have this idea of memories, this one is for the books, I really do think.
That's right, absolutely. And people have been dreaming about it.
Yeah.
Since before, for years. In my new book, I actually have, I was able to include some COVID pandemic related dreams from some precogs that I work with.
Yeah.
And that they get a date back several years, actually. So this will provide rich fodder for precognitive research as people delve into their dream records, which is something that I'm hoping to encourage readers of my new book to do, because that's what it's all about.
I think you asked on Twitter, people reach out to me, Eric, obviously, reach out to me about if they had dreams before all of this stuff started happening in 2020. And I think I replied to you just like, I actually had the opposite. Like my dreams, they just went away. Like they stopped. Like it was like something like a fire hose, which I'm a great dreamer, but up into about the second week of February, it's like it just turned off immediately, which I inexplicable, but that was my reaction to everything. So it was very, very bizarre.
Yeah, everybody's dream life changed in one way or another, but a lot of people said the same thing that you did, that their dreams just actually went away or got really bland.
Yeah.
A lot of people told me that. So, I mean, I got both reactions.
Right. Now, the reason that we're talking about dreams is that a lot of Dr. Wargo's ideas come from this idea that somehow we are able to see into our future, and some of the ways in which we do this is through our dreams and through creative activities such as art. So I definitely had to have him on the show. I read his book for the first time about maybe early 2019, and I was flabbergasted by it. I think I read it 3 times in 6 months, and it was one of those things that really clicked with me. Now, when I was younger, I was terrified by the idea of time. I would not sleep at night for about 5 years. I would barely sleep, just sitting in my bed thinking about the idea of time and when time runs out and death, and it was causing me a great deal of anxiety. And so your book in some way, I wouldn't say it helped me with the anxiety, but it's just, I have this overarching fascination with time itself. Were you always fascinated with the idea of time, Eric? Were you like one of those people that the Star Trek episodes dealing with time were always your favorite? I mean, when did you become so enamored with this idea of time and the flexibility and the peculiarities of it?
Well, it was a gradual process. I became very interested in memory in college. And I'll tell you, I'm a big book guy. I love books, and books, sort of significant books, kind of mark my biography. And I will never forget, I was working I don't remember if this is my probably my junior year of college at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And I was working at the rental desk for the film studies department. I did a lot of film, and I worked, renting cameras and audio recorders and stuff.
Right.
And I'll never forget that one of the visiting professors, I don't even remember his name, unfortunately, was this kind of eccentric, strange guy. And he came in one day and we were talking. I don't remember what we were talking about, but he said, the most interesting book I've ever read is called The Art of Memory by, I'm blanking her name,
Dame Frances Yates.
Frances Yates, Dame
Yes.
Frances Yates, right? Yeah. And when a strange person tells me the most interesting book I ever read was, so I headed to the university bookstore and got a copy, and that was an amazing reading experience. It totally, boy, it just grabbed me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as much as any other, I read a lot of very cool stuff in college, but I think as much as any other book, that kind of ultimately set me on the path towards the occult.
Right.
I didn't at that time know anything about Hermeticism really, and even reading her book,
right,
the references to Hermetic philosophy and all that just was over my head. I was just interested in this memory technique, that the ancient orators used, because my God, it works. I mean, you suddenly practice it, and this is a miracle.
Right.
That fascinated me, and so then fast forward several years, I was living in Prague, as a matter of fact. This was in the mid-90s. A lot of Americans and Canadians went to Prague in the 90s. It was sort of they sort of called it Paris of the, it was like the idea was sort of like Paris of the 20s. Right. A lot of expats and there, and of course Prague was the capital of alchemy and Hermetic thought in the the Renaissance. And while I was there happened to be a big conference on alchemy and a big exhibition related to Rudolph II, the sort of patron,
great guy,
crazy emperor who supported all these alchemists from around Europe. And so that exposed me to alchemy and Hermetic philosophy, and that gave me then this context for the Art of Memory stuff that I had read in college. And so I spent several years kind of going down the rabbit hole of alchemy after that point. And then that kind of led to Carl Jung, as it always does. And then, and then various other things. but so I think my interest in memory is where my interest in all this comes from.
Right.
And in tandem with the Art of Memory stuff is my interest in psychoanalysis. I was kind of steeped in psychoanalysis in my graduate education. I had always been interested in dreams and the unconscious and so forth, and so I was just hooked by Freud.
Yeah.
And then especially by, this was the early 90s, so I was especially hooked by Lacan and via Slavoj Žižek, because Slavoj Žižek was just coming out with his early books in the early 90s. And, he was a tremendously exciting thinker at that time. I mean, he's sort of become the bloated Jabba the Hutt of philosophy now. but at the time, he was super exciting. Actually, I say that. I love Slavoj Žižek now. But at the time, there was nothing more exciting in the intellectual scene than Slavoj Žižek and his essentially making this incredibly impenetrable French psychoanalyst accessible. And so I got super excited by the psychoanalytic tradition, the Freud and Lacan and so on. And that, too, is all about memory.
Right.
So, these two, I guess, intellectual threads kind of ultimately entwined, certainly very strongly in the work I'm doing now. But I wasn't explicitly interested in time per se. And it's funny that you mentioned the Star Trek episodes about time travel,
Right.
because unconsciously I was very. Those are my favorite episodes, and
I can kind of tell. I can kind of
a
tell.
poster of. It's not in this office yet. It's still, because I just moved, but a poster, a wonderful poster of The City on the Edge of Forever.
It's classic.
Classic episode.
Classic.
And that, in fact, I now have discovered has figured in my dreams over the years, over the decades. And I realize why, that I was already dreaming of my future as a time loops researcher, someone studying time travel, at least in the form of precognition and memory and so on. So yeah, it's funny that you mentioned Star Trek and time travel, because Star Trek was what sort of programmed me as a child, and it remains my kind of archetypal mental structure. And what it has to say about time travel has been very important to me.
Absolutely. You started your blog, The Nightshirt, which is it's constantly a joy to go through old articles. Part of me wanted to go through every article, start at the beginning and go through every article, but I find it's more fruitful to see this interesting evolution of what you write about. But you started The Nightshirt because, and I might be wrong here, but correct me if I am wrong, because of a series of UFO sightings?
Actually, I think I'd actually started the blog a couple of years before I ever had a UFO sighting, and yet precognitively I sort of subtitled the blog, sightings, portents, forebodings, suspicions, all of which are things that I only became consciously interested in years after I had this idea for a blog. Anyway, and I started writing in earnest about the paranormal in 2009 after a couple of UFO sightings, exactly a month apart, July and August of 2009. Yeah, so that sent me down the rabbit hole of ufology, and which led me to parapsychology. Yeah. Ultimately, I sort of jettisoned ufology because it's just a quagmire of shady people and dubious ideas.
Although your last article had some UFOs in it on the Nightshirt, it revisited a bit of the ideas of UFOs.
Yeah, I like to speculate a little bit from the edges, but I'm not. I do not.
Right.
I do not delve into I do not get
them
involved.
Murky waters. They
are. I'm too deeply distrustful.
Fair enough. I hear you.
Parapsychology really bit me, and the topic of precognition really grabbed me, partly because it's something I didn't believe in. I was sort of, I guess, a product of my scientific background. My parents had been scientific psychologists. Without ever articulating it explicitly, I was what we now call a hardcore materialist.
Fundamental materialist.
Sort of using that term as an epithet. I'm still a materialist, but a different kind of materialist than an unthinking kind of knee-jerk skeptic about things like psychic phenomena. Right. And while I didn't have any problem with the idea of UFOs as a materialist, I did have a problem with ESP. It just didn't. I didn't see how it could work. But the famous paper, which I've talked about a lot on my blog and in my book, Feeling the Future by Daryl Bem, eminent Cornell psychologist in 2011, really grabbed me, troubled me.
Earth-shaking.
And grabbed me. Yeah, it's funny. The reactions to that paper are as interesting as the paper itself.
Agreed.
I happened to be working at that time as editorial director, in fact, for a scientific psychology organization, and it was the rival organization of the organization that had published this paper. And some of my colleagues were all set to write this very strongly worded protest to the journal in question about protesting that such preposterous bullshit shouldn't, sully the pages of a psychology journal. And I guess that was an eye-opening experience, because I saw firsthand the true hostility
Right.
of psychologists toward
Anything extraordinary.
well, yeah, but here was an actual a very respected
Absolutely.
scientist publishing peer-reviewed
Right.
findings, but being pushed back against
Right.
by members of his community because they just couldn't believe it. So, how is that scientific?
Right.
To that was a bit of I don't know if it was cognitive dissonance for me, and I just saw that. Well, I saw that there's something wrong here. If these people who pretend to be scientists are dogmatically opposed to certain ideas,
Yeah.
or to a finding that they can't explain because it upsets them,
Right.
that's a problem. So that kind of
More threads kind of pulling you somewhere.
yeah. Well, I guess I have this contrarian streak in me when I sense someone, or someone being bullied for their ideas.
Right.
I'm curious. What are those ideas? Is there something here? And I then went down the path of reading more intensely. Actually, for a couple of years, I'd already been very interestedly reading the literature on remote viewing.
Okay.
And, broadening my mind about that aspect of psychic phenomena. But, there's no more outrageous psychic modality than precognition. I mean, that just defies, everything we hold dear.
Right.
And so it was, I think, Daryl Bem's paper that really, forced me to start thinking about that.
Had you read Dunn's An Experiment with Time before or after?
No, it was shortly thereafter that I read Dunn. Yeah, I think it was in 2011, 2012, probably, that I read his book. And that, too, was a milestone for me, in part because I had some dreams that had come true shortly thereafter. I'd had a dream on 9/11. I'd had another dream in 2008 that was, uncannily like something that happened at work the next day. And I had just kind of forgotten about them because they didn't fit into my mental models. And this is something I talk about in the new book. I mean, I use the analogy of river Lethe, from mythology, is sort of, you forget because you don't have any context for these kinds of experiences, you just forget them. And it's just sort of this amazing power of forgetting that it almost works like a spell on you. You have a paranormal experience that just doesn't fit, and you don't have context for it. And if you can't talk about it with someone who's able to give you some context or give you some kind of reassurance that, this kind of thing happens, if you don't have that, you sweep it under your mental rug, as I like to say. So there was a kind of working through process for me, and realizing, this is an interesting topic, and in fact, I am an experiencer of it. I just sort of shoved it aside all these years. And so what Dunn's book got me to do was engage in what I now call precognitive dreamwork, which is most basically, Dunn outlined the most basic skeleton principles, which is simply record all your dreams, which a lot of people do, but they don't do the second part, which is go back to your dream records
always
every night. Look at at least look at the last few days' dream records at the end of every day. And just kind of reflect on those dreams you wrote down and events that have happened in that window of time. No one does that. I mean, that's just not an intuitive thing to do. If you go back to your dream record, it may be months, years later, and by then you've totally forgotten
everything's gone.
So that's the most basic key. And his book was wonderful because it was an early example of what we would now call citizen science. He was trying to inspire other people to do the same thing, to verify what he had found in his own life, which is that many of his dreams were actually, I hate the term coming true, but let's just use that, coming true, often within a day or two, sometimes longer, but very often, very soon. And he noticed patterns about exciting story in the news, for instance, with details that were very specific, in his dreams. So that was very important for me. And now what I've tried to do with the new book is sort of bring Dunn up to the 21st century with a bunch of added principles to really greatly intensify the number of precognitive dreams you can capture. Because what Dunn didn't, although Dunn was well aware of Freud, he wasn't really working with psychoanalytic ideas. He certainly had no knowledge at that point of the neuroscience of dreaming, nor was there any inkling at that point that dreams relate to memory. And this is getting back to the art of memory. It's now pretty apparent that dreaming is essentially the art of memory operating while we're asleep automatically, because it's about making new memories based on our experiences. And my argument is that memory goes both directions.
Right.
And we are making memories about future experiences every night. This is a regular function of dreaming.
You once said that, and I love this, and I've said it in my program several times, that dreams are future structures built of past bricks.
Yes. This book, the new book, goes into great detail on that idea. With a lot of examples, both of from my own dream life and from many other dreamers who have shared their stories with me. It's a very basic principle that the brain is working with experiences that it has already had for the most part, but it's constantly, there's a flow of information from the future, from its own future, from the brain's own future, and it can't make sense of it. It can use what's at hand, so life experiences you've already had, to as symbols, to represent this future thought, future idea, future experience. So yes, that idea that dreams build future towers out of past bricks is a very central principle in precognitive dream work as I'm formulating it.
Now, the work of, I believe it's Sue Llewellyn as well, was at least in Time Loops. Was it from her that you got this idea of the dreams being the memory theater or the memory palaces of our past, to be able to create these images of our future that hasn't arrived yet? Was it from her?
No, she doesn't. First of all, she's not at all talking about precognition. She's just formulating a theory of dreaming. I actually came up with, I have to say, I when I encountered her article in 2013, it was with great mixed feelings, because I had actually hit on this idea on my own years earlier. I'd even written about it on my blog. I had a whole lengthy article sort of laying out the hypothesis. This was before I was even interested in precognitive dreaming, laying out the hypothesis that dreaming is essentially the art of memory operating. And I'd always intended to write an article, maybe publish an article about this, and I'm lazy and I never did. And then Sue Llewellyn wrote this brilliant article, not only making that case, but also really linking it to the neuroscience of dreaming. It's a very comprehensive article that really ties together, everything we know about the neurobiology of dreaming, and so on, which is, and so, she deserves the credit for this idea. But
I hate when that happens.
It was one of those things, got scooped, but in this case, scooped by someone, better able to articulate the idea and better able to ground it in science than I was. But I think, honestly, anyone who works with the art of memory intuitively knows that dreaming is the same thing. I mean, it's Freud didn't. Well, I've said this. I think I say this in Time Loops. Freud was ultimately he was a theorist of memory, and he didn't know it. And people haven't recognized that about him. And
Everybody go to Jung, right? They'll go to Jung for that stuff.
yeah, well, Freud there's this idea that somehow Freud has been debunked or whatever, and people reduce him to the sex stuff, and
Right.
people don't realize how important Freud was and how important his central ideas were. And I mean by central ideas, I don't mean penis envy and all that crap. I mean the idea of the unconscious
Right.
and the way the unconscious works. And the way the unconscious works, via dreams and via slips of the tongue and via symptoms and that. I mean, that's his metapsychology is what it's called, is super, super important. I mean, it's the most incredible, radical idea. Well, not the most, one of the most incredible, radical, powerful ideas of the last century and a half, and it's right up there with evolution and relativity, and so on. It's troubling to people, and it's troubling to scientists because it's not completely scientific. I mean, it's very hard to prove any kind of claim about the unconscious, because it's has to do with meaning, and it's personal, and meaning is always personal. And so he was this brilliant thinker that straddled sciences and humanities, and that's what psychoanalysis is this kind of straddling of these two domains, two separate discourses even that don't ever quite intersect or mesh up. Right. But that's what's so rich and powerful in his work, and why people who get into Freud and get into the psychoanalytic tradition get so hooked by it. It's very powerful, and I don't mean powerful for diagnosing your friend's neuroses. That's not what it's about. It's just the theory, the metapsychology.
Right. You even have in the book that at some points he probably was in some way psychic, seeing,
absolutely,
remembering some part of his own demise.
His most famous. This is the most amazing, incredible ironies of Freud's life.
Right.
In a life full of ironies.
Yeah.
The very dream that gave him his theory of dreams ended up precognitive of the health crisis that transformed his life in his last decade and a half of his life.
Right.
And yet his denial of the idea of precognition in dreams is part of what created this time loop. It's just I can go on and on about this story, and I actually return to it in the new book as well, because it's so freaking rich. It is. But it's a perfect example of that principle we were talking about. The dreams build future towers out of past bricks, because essentially what it did was take these thoughts from his future. Principally, I would say there are a few thoughts that seem to be bundled in that dream. Principally, regret at his smoking. I mean, the smoking was his cancer was caused by smoking. Right. Regret that he hadn't quit smoking on the advice of his friend, as well as potentially regrets about being so vociferous about dreams not being precognitive. And his dream really turned out to be a premonition. Yeah. All these thoughts are bundled up in these symbols that were from his, the year 1895, I believe, which is when he had the dream. His patient, Anna Hammerschlag, who he was treating at the time, and all these figures in his life at that time are in this dream, in this hall, at this house, in this dream. And they're all being used like as almost action figures in kind of a diorama to represent these thoughts that he would have 23 years later in his life. And it's just amazing. So again, future towers built out of past bricks.
Absolutely. In maybe not the simplest way, because you wrote an entire book about it, but how would you, to somebody who has never encountered the idea before, summarize to them what a time loop is?
Okay. Time loops are causally circular structures in space-time. Now, what does that mean? Okay, so people think my work is about precognition and retrocausation. Retrocausation being the idea that events or experiences in the future can influence events or experiences in the present,
Right.
or put alternatively, the events and experiences in the present can influence events and experiences in the past. Okay, so causes going backwards. Precognition is a manifestation of that. It's often is described as seeing the future, but what it really means is information from the future somehow propagating backwards in time
Right.
to the present. Okay. Now, that idea is not new or radical at all. I mean, plenty of people have argued for precognition and people have argued for retrocausation before. But what tends to act as a brake on people's thinking about this topic is they think that it's paradoxical to talk about a causally circular structure, like an event causing something in the past, which that past event also leads to that event in the future.
Right.
That's where people get hung up.
Yeah.
And the reason they get hung up is they think it's a paradox. Okay, people are used to this idea of the grandfather paradox, the idea of in time travel
Right.
stories. You go back in time and kill your grandfather, and you were never born, and thus you can't have ever gone back in time to kill your grandfather. And so it's a paradox. It doesn't make logical sense, and it's impossible.
Right.
And in fact, that idea has led many great minds to think that, well, time travel therefore is impossible, and therefore something like retrocausation and precognition would also, by implication, be impossible, because precognition itself is time travel. It's information from the future traveling backwards in time. Right. What I have to drive home again and again and again is there's nothing paradoxical about an influence from the future affecting something in the past, as long as it leads to that same outcome in the future. That is a causally circular structure. That is what I mean by a time loop.
Right.
And essentially, when you delve into the topic of precognition, you realize that all prophecies, all precognitive dreams, so forth, are self-fulfilling. In one way or another, they lead, your actions that you may take because of a precognitive dream or whatever. In one way or another, your actions are going to produce that future experience that propagated backward in time. So there's always a loopy structure. I'll give you a perfect example of this, and I'm sure all of your listeners already know from having read it in a million books, and that's, of course, Carl Jung's story from Synchronicity, right. The book Synchronicity, about his patient who came to him with a dream about being given a piece of scarab jewelry. Right. And just as she's telling him this dream, he hears a tapping on the window and turns around, and lo and behold, it's a little relative of the scarab beetle, a rose chafer beetle. And he opens the window, lets it into his room, and hands it to his patient and says, "Here's your scarab." Right. Well, what's really going on here? Is this cosmic meanings aligning impersonally, right, in order to edify this patient, with this symbol of transformation? No, that's not what's happening. What's happening is a very simple, what we call in the business a Dunn dream. The kind of dream that J.W. Dunn, right, described, many examples of in his book, and that you'll find in many, many, many books on precognitive dreaming. And that is that there's this therapeutically and personally significant moment in this woman's doctor's office, right, where she's handed a beetle, and she's treated with this wonderful, fascinating discourse about the significance of the scarab beetle in Egyptian religion, all that. So it's exactly the stuff that patients flocked to Jung's clinic for, because
the mystic.
Suddenly their little symptoms and their problems became cosmic, archetypal, and they loved hearing that. And Jung was a very charismatic guy, so these moments in his clinic were very significant, right, for people at the time. So this is a very precognition worthy moment. And so the night before, she has a dream about somebody handing her a piece of scarab jewelry. Okay. Now, the loopiness aspect of it here is that it was only because she told Jung
right.
the dream in his office that made him notice that it was pay attention to this beetle at his window and open it up and give it to her.
Right.
Okay. It was only her telling about this dream that led to the events that she had dreamed about the night before. So that is the time loop aspect. And that's where people like steam starts going out their ears, and they start hold on, there's something wrong here. And they think it's a paradox. And no, it's not a paradox.
No.
This is the way the world works. The world is built of these things. They're built of time loops. Every precognitive dream has that same structure. And there's nothing paradoxical in it at all. But it helps explain why dreams are distorted, why all the phenomena that Freud chalked up to a sensor in the brain that didn't want you to know the truth about your thoughts, and thus it distorted them and forced them into symbolic disguises and so forth. He thought that this was all to protect us from unwanted thoughts and from forbidden thoughts, like wanting to sleep with your mother and all that. But no, our thoughts from the future are distorted because they have to be in order to get us to take the actions that will lead to those futures. And this is a basic principle from mythology. Oedipus, the Oedipus story, for instance. Prophecies, we intrinsically act to avoid bad prophecies
Yes.
and fulfill good ones. So we've got lots of stories from myth and legend about this problem, about prophecies that people try to avoid fulfilling, but wind up fulfilling in the process of trying to avoid them.
Right.
And on the other hand, you have things like Macbeth, which is, where you have a prophecy that seems like a really good prophecy, and so the person acts, to fulfill it, but fulfills it in a way that you didn't think he was fulfilling it.
Right.
This way in which future information has to be distorted for us to take the actions necessary to fulfill it in the future. Right. That, I am arguing in the new book, explains the sort of symbolic distortions of dreams and symptoms and so on. All the stuff that Freud was studying, but he was working with a model of the unconscious as some reservoir of thought that was going on simultaneous with, our daily thoughts. I think we need to turn Freud on its side and see the unconscious as our future thoughts, right, as they are influencing us in the present. So a time loop. And this, going back to the scarab example, this illuminates so much about a precognitive dream. For instance, there's a transformation that goes on in the dream. Right. In reality, the woman is handed a real insect. Right. A rose chafer wriggling beetle in Jung's hand. Well, the dream transforms it into a piece of golden, costly jewelry. Well, that expresses something. That expresses something about the value of that moment in her life. I mean, this was a priceless moment in her life, in part because it actually ended up getting her written into his most famous book. I mean, it's like
we're still talking about it.
This was not only important the next day in his office, but it was important 30 years later, right, when this event probably happened in 1920, and he wrote about her, and they were still friends in 1950 when he was composing his book Synchronicity. So dreams transform our thoughts, and it's not to disguise them, but it's those transformations make us fail to recognize what they're really about.
Yeah.
And as a result, we end up taking the courses of action that lead to the events in the future that we were dreaming about. So it's all time loops.
Yeah.
That's a long answer.
No, I love it. No, it was one of those things where I don't think I've ever read a book where I've had to put it down more times or have to reread paragraphs, because you go through it so well in that this idea of time loops almost takes these very disparate forms of what we would call psi or psychic ability and kind of just puts them into, like, not under one umbrella, but just basically is able to say all of these things might be misrecognized time loops, basically, which is, to me, it was just such an incredible journey. What I also found incredibly interesting about the book was that the difference, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, the difference you say is that we ourselves, our individual selves and our memories are kind of like the difference in the equation, and specifically through something called jouissance, which to this day I'm still trying to wrap my head around. Can you explain a little bit more about how, specifically, maybe even seeing things like disasters in the future? Like, people have, I had this dream about a plane crash, and then the day after there was this plane crash. When you say, well, it's not that you're seeing the crash, you're seeing perhaps your reaction to the crash itself, right? Can you maybe illuminate this a little bit more? Because this, to me, was incredible.
Yeah, there's two things going on here in your question. I mean, first of all, precognition, and this is something that J.W. Dunn discovered in his own sort of very careful scrutiny of his own dreams, a century ago, basically, over a century ago. No, yeah, roughly a century ago, that his dreams were not about events happening in some objective future reality. Right. They were about his own encounter with the news of those events. So, for instance, his famous dream about a volcano eruption. He dreams he's on an island, and he knows that somehow 4,000 people are going to die because it's going to erupt, and blah, blah, blah. Okay, and so a few days later, reads a newspaper, opens the newspaper, there's a headline about the Mount Pelée eruption on the island of Martinique, with 40,000 killed. Right. And he realizes, oh my God, my dream was precognitive of that. But through sort of forensic analysis of the discrepancies between his dreams and the actual events, he was able to determine that in every case, what he was dreaming about was not the event. He was dreaming about the news story, or he was dreaming about his reaction to a news story or a letter, or the way he found out about this distant event. So his dreams were a connection to himself across time. We even talked in terms of a brain line. We physicists already, I think at that point, were talking in terms of world lines, because we exist in a four-dimensional block space-time continuum, and objects follow lines or paths through that universe. And so he talked about the brain as a brain line. Okay, well, he's exactly right. Precognition is about the brain's connection to itself across time. It's not about a connection to other events. So no information needs to transfer across space. Right. And this is the great, unfortunately, I think, barrier that parapsychologists have just not been able to cross or penetrate. Most parapsychologists to this day are physicists or engineers, and so they like thinking in terms of signals and transmission of information across space. They don't like to think about, first, they don't want to think in terms of the brain, because most of them aren't neuroscientists or psychologists, and the idea of the brain as kind of a wire or conduit to its own future. The brain is a material object existing in time, and so no information has to venture outside the brain or come from outside the brain. The brain can just be connected to itself, and it can learn things in the future the same way it learned things in the past, by reading the news or having an experience, a firsthand personal experience. But it can learn about distant events via watching them on television, and it can do that 2 days from now. And I might have a dream tonight about something that I see on TV in 2 days. Right. And I'll obviously, if I'm not thinking about this stuff, I'll naturally think that I was dreaming about that event, in some other country or whatever. But no, I'm dreaming about my own watching that that event on TV in 2 days. Again and again, when you study precognitive experiences when you have enough data to study them. Unfortunately, 99% of the time, we don't have all the data we'd like. We don't know exactly how the person found out about event, X in their future and so on. But when we do have that data, it's very apparent that this is the brain's connection to itself across time, not connection to remote events or whatever.
So about 4 days ago, I had a dream about Chuck Yeager, who died, I believe,
Who
yesterday.
Just died yesterday. Yeah. Yes.
I had a dream memory of my grandfather was in the military. My father was, his son. He used to like to build models, and we had. I remember my father when I was about 6 years old. He bought the model of the airplane that Chuck Yeager broke the speed of sound with.
Glamorous Glennis.
Yes. And 4 days ago, I had a dream about Chuck Yeager, who I found out again was just, and I do the thing that, and I've told all of my listeners, like, guys, if you want to see just how real this kind of stuff is, record your dreams, write your dreams down, but just actually have them on either paper or on a sound recording device, which is what I use, is you can go back, and it's just like, it's frightening how apparent these kind of things are. So it's so interesting to me. Something that you mentioned a little bit earlier, a glass block universe. I actually emailed you a couple of months ago when it was about an article that you'd written on the Nightshirt about Alan Moore talking about a glass football, which has the big bang at one end and the big crunch on the other, and just how you were dealing with, through this article, the idea of a glass block universe. And I said, I want to talk about this a little bit. And then you emailed me back basically saying, my ideas have changed a wee bit since I put out that article. I do think in some way that Minkowski's glass block universe could be correct. So if this is that all-time, everything that has happened is basically there in this glass block. This brings up the idea that something that a lot of people of my proclivities are obsessed with, which is the idea of free will, or being able to have a consequence on future actions. You bring up something in the book, Time Loops, about Libet's golem. Can you explain this a little bit more?
Yeah. Well, Benjamin Libet, I guess is how you pronounce his name, or Libet, is the neuroscientist who did a series of really fascinating studies in the late 70s, I believe, early 80s,
right,
where he discovered that when we form an intention to make a motor action, like move a finger or whatever, that the nerves actually start to charge up in our finger a few hundred milliseconds before we are aware of the intention to move our finger. And basically, his work essentially pulled the rug out from under the idea that we exert conscious will over our actions. And other psychologists and neuroscientists sort of had a field day with this because, I don't know, psychologists kind of love pulling the rug out from under our everyday assumptions about reality. And for all my criticisms about psychology and psychologists, and I have a lot of them, I actually love this particular body of work and find it very, very compelling because it meshes with, well, not only does it mesh with everything I'm studying in terms of time loops, it also meshes with my personal experience with meditation. I'm a Zen meditator and have been for decades. And I'll tell you that when you kind of drill down, Zen sort of gets you to try to drill down into your conscious will, essentially, right, and find out what it's about. Like where is the source of your actions? Where is the source of your decisions? Where is the source of your choices and so forth? It gets you to do this with kind of a knowing wink that, hey, guess what? You're going to find out something kind of disturbing that there's no you, there's no agent there, right, like you think there is. There's no little U-shaped, there's no little. I can't open up my head, and there's no little Eric Wargo shaped homunculus in there who's like, pulling the levers and all that. There's nothing like that.
Right.
And guess what? That's what Freud said. That's what everyone in the psychoanalytic tradition has said. So really, Libet and that school are in very good company philosophically, because they are saying exactly what, at least Zen meditators have said for centuries, millennia, and what the psychoanalytic tradition has said, that whatever motivates us, whatever is pulling the strings, it's not our conscious thoughts in the moment. But here's the funny thing. When you take these ideas and plug it into the time loops sort of reframing or flipping of Freud that I do, you realize that in fact, where our conscious will, if our unconscious is just our conscious thought displaced in time from our future, okay? Well, that means that my consciousness now, even if I'm not the one pulling my strings right now and talking to you and so forth, I may be right now pulling my strings in my past.
Right.
Okay? So that's what I mean by Libet's golem, that there may be conscious will and free will, but it's not exerted over our forward-going actions. Mm-hmm. Our thoughts and intentions in the present are exerting a kind of influence over our past actions. And so this is another theme that I delve into much more fully in the new book, thinking about how rescuing the idea of free will, but thinking of it backwards, that essentially we are constantly in our lives, whenever we have powerful experiences, when we're profoundly moved or amazed. I think one of the points I make in the book is that I think amazement is possibly one of the most powerful levers of our past, or the ways that we, in the present, influence ourselves in the past. So I think the more we can generate amazement, that may be sort of the doorway to a kind of future four-dimensional human who's actually consciously manipulating their own past in order to create better outcomes in their future. But I think that free will is exerted backwards in time, not forwards in time. I think we are...
That's insane.
And it's very imperfect because we don't realize that that's what's happening. We go through life believing we have this thing called free will that's somehow masters of our fate and so on. Right. But really, our intentions and so forth are exerting a retro effect on our past. And through things like precognitive dreamwork and delving into our past, delving into our biography in a much more fine-grained kind of way, we can start to see these effects, to start to see how Eric Wargo today influenced Eric Wargo a year ago or 30 years ago, and start to work with that.
Right.
It's sort of led me to a realm that I'd always kind of been put off by, which is magic. I'd never resonated with magic, ritual magic, right. Chaos magic. It always kind of annoyed me. It just was not an idiom that I was at all interested in. Right. Partly because I don't believe in intention. I don't believe in requesting something from the universe and
it answers the call.
Performing some action to obtain that. I'm a much more Taoist, right. In my sensibilities. Like I like to let things happen and watch. But I realized that where this idea of time loops and Libet's golem and the long self, where this is really leading to is a kind of magical approach to life. And I realized that, okay, this is basically what magicians and so forth have been doing from the start, but they were using a different idiom. Right. And they weren't necessarily talking in terms of time and retrocausation. There is one magician who does talk in those terms, and I'm blanking on his name. But anyway, I'm realizing, okay, where I'm headed is kind of I'm coming around to this kind of magical idiom and thinking in terms of magic. And so I've actually started consciously working with symbols in my own life in a sort of what a magician would recognize as magical, as magic, but only because I've backed into it from this.
You're kind of forced to have to.
Way.
I love it. It's one of those things that, and I've been doing it for a long time because dreams have been, as you know, the most insane thing, and you talk about this in Time Loops, the most insane thing ever is, well, one, that consciousness is just an epiphenomenon of the brain. The second one is that dreams are absolutely meaningless. And I know this is totally untrue, and most people throughout time have recognized that this is completely untrue as well. So a lot of the ways in which I personally choose my targets of enchantment is via dreams. But it's not one of those things where I have a dream about having a new job and then next thing I know is like, I'm going to do magical things until I have a new job. The symbols and the things that occur in the dream, those are so oblique, and you mentioned this quite a bit in Time Loops, that they're so oblique that they can't be specific. But in some ways, they leave a kind of intuitive residue. And I don't know if you're going to be talking about this in the new book, but I'm left with a feeling through a lot of dreams that's not like A to B correlation, but a way of seeing that perhaps that is, I won't know until it happens, but perhaps that is in some way somewhere up ahead in the road for me. So this idea of precognitive dream work to me is entirely fascinating. And it's one of those things where it's available to almost all of us. So it's so strange. But you, I'm just going to segue in here to something else. But you've also, I believe it was a Twitter conversation you had very shortly with Jennifer Dumpert about the idea of hypnagogia and hypnopompia. For people that don't know, hypnopompia is the feeling that you have right after you wake up from a dream state, and hypnagogia is that those moments you have right before you fall asleep. And you said something in this Twitter exchange with Jennifer Dumpert, the author of Liminal Dreaming, that perhaps that these moments are actually even more precognitive. Can you elucidate on this a little bit more?
I think all these states are basically precognitive, but I suspect, and there's no way you'd ever prove this, but I suspect that all dreams are precognitive or have precognitive content in them. Nice. Likewise, and hypnagogia and hypnopompia are just sort of extensions of the dream state, I think, and it's true of them as well. Now, some of my most vivid precognitive experiences have been in the hypnagogic or hypnopompic state. Well, not just vivid, but short term, like something definitely within the next couple of days, have been in those states. So this is one of the things I lay out in the new book, is that pay particular attention to hypnagogic images. Write those. It's incredibly hard. I mean, if you think it's hard to be disciplined about keeping a dream diary, it's 10 times as hard to write down these kinds of images, because usually you're so sleepy and like you're just on the edge of sleep, and it's so blissful to be about to fall asleep, and you have to rip yourself out of that to write down what you saw, and there's no way you're going to remember it if you don't do that, and you're going to convince yourself, no, that was so, there's no way I'm going to forget that. You totally forget it.
Right.
So you have to.
There's techniques.
There's techniques. Yeah.
Yep. There's techniques.
But yeah, some of my most vivid, I'll one of them I talk about in the new book. I had nose surgery that morning, so I was not able to lay down to go to sleep that night. It was really, I had to fix my deviated septum. But yeah, I was like sitting up, propped up in bed on these pillows, and I was exhausted. I felt awful and in pain, but I was like nodding off. I was like into this having these hypnagogic dreams, and at one point I nodded off, and I swear to God, it felt like a portal opened up to the brain of David Lynch. Okay, and like I'm a huge David Lynch fan.
Okay,
and what I saw in this moment was this succession of paintings. Basically, I was like, two of them were like a diptych, like two panels, big panels, and they were very brown, very muddy brown, and the figure in this brown, muddy landscape. And in his distinctive voice, David Lynch was telling me that he wanted people to meditate in front of his paintings like corpses. Okay, this is what he said. I want you to treat my paintings as corpses and meditate in front of them.
Pretty on brand for him.
That it was very distinctive. And this is probably just a split second, you know, and like I woke up, but it was like, oh my God, it was like, it was incredible. It's like, so, you know, I was propped up. I probably already had my notebook there ready. So I wrote this down. Okay, well, 2 days later, and I'll also say that although I knew David Lynch, this was a few years ago, several years ago, I knew that he was a painter in addition to, you know, a filmmaker, but had not seen many or any of his paintings at that point. I really didn't know that side of him. Okay, well, 2 days later, the Sunday art section of the New York Times, boom, there's this big feature about this new exhibition of David Lynch's work that was going to be in the Philadelphia Art College that he had studied at as a young man. Okay, so the first picture was of him painting in his atelier, and leaning behind him on the wall were the two right panels of a triptych. The third was cut off by the painting, but the two right panels were this muddy brown landscape with a figure in it. It was like basically what I'd seen, the very same colors and everything like that. In the article, he talks about his meditation practice. Everyone knows that he's a transcendental meditator, all that. But he additionally talked about how when he was in studying art, he got permission to go into the morgue, the city morgue, at night and study the decaying corpses.
Jeez.
Okay, and so that's just an example. I've got lots of examples like that in my dream diary of hypnagogic images that very vividly. Often it's a visual, just a visual image, and I'll sort of roughly sketch it or whatever, and then boom, the next day I'll see something. Often it's on Twitter, you know, some image that's like, holy crap, it's exactly what I saw, you know, in that state. So I encourage people to work with liminal dreams because they're particularly rich, but a lot of challenges. Yeah, because it's like you really have to be dedicated to do it.
Do. I mean, there's the old Salvador Dali having a brass bucket and a rock, but there really are ways, and it definitely does take work. But once you get there, it is shocking. This brings me to another thing that I definitely want to touch on, because to somebody like myself, these kind of truths, they're so evident, and there's so much evidence around it. To somebody like yourself, the same thing goes. But why isn't it that these ideas, things like time loops, which we see evidences with, I mean, you bring up the University of Rochester experiment in 2009, but why aren't these things being taken up as a handle by more people that are more materialist, more fundamental materialist, more scientific minded? Like, how many people are going to lose their fucking jobs if they take up this idea that perhaps we can in some small way apprehend bits of our future via ways of looking at our past and whatnot? So like, what do you think the hesitancy is, Eric?
Oh, there's so many sources of hesitancy. I mean, just talking in terms of scientific culture and academic culture, I think, well, it partly goes back to the Enlightenment. I mean, we had the Enlightenment, one of the core rules of the Enlightenment was not allowing teleology. Okay, you couldn't have causes propagating backwards in time. And the reason was that at the time, teleology sort of implied God, okay? Right. If you're talking about teleology 3 centuries ago or whatever, just the implication of anything teleological was theological, that it was somehow God's purpose, creation, and so forth. And that was just no fair. You know, it wasn't any fair to bring God into your explanations if you were going to be a scientist. So they had to be resolute. Right. And you can see why they had to be, I mean, in that culture. But I think we're kind of living now with the legacy of this notion that somehow anything teleological is somehow theological or supernatural. Right. I think that the change is going to happen, or the paradigm shift is going to happen. It's going to have to start with physics. And it already has. I mean, it's really only in physics that people are taking seriously the idea of retrocausation. It's been an idea since the middle of the century, in fact, and more physicists legitimate physicists are invoking retrocausation. And I think since all of the sort of academic disciplines, or at least scientific disciplines, kind of look to physics is somehow the top of the pyramid.
Right.
I think only when more physicists start to talk about retrocausation as an alternative framework for understanding the measurement problem
right.
in quantum physics. I think when more physicists do that, I think that is what is then going to trickle down to other fields and let people in biology and so on
right.
start thinking in terms of retrocausal processes. And I think it's going to happen because we are seeing experiments. The really interesting field is quantum computing because
right.
Every month there's some new headline about quantum computing researchers reversing the causal order in a computation. I really have this, and it's funny to talk about the future of physics when you're not a physicist, but I really do think that that quantum computing right now, quantum computing, it seems like, as an outside spectator watching the field, it seems like these people are just so beholden to the model of classical computation that they're not really thinking outside the box, that maybe what they're working with aren't computers at all. Maybe what they're working with are essentially precognitive circuits,
right.
Because that's what these articles that talk about reversing temporal order in a computation, that's what it amounts to, is the potential to have an output prior to an input,
Right.
And gosh, that seems like a much more interesting application than just a super powered number cruncher somehow. I don't know. Maybe it's just me, but come on, why don't you think outside the box here and think about how you can leverage these time defying properties of a quantum computer. So I don't know. I like to think that sometime in the next 10 years in these fields, we're going to see a kind of real thaw towards the idea of teleology.
Right.
And that's going to then affect immediately biology, because the frontier of biology right now is quantum biology. And so when it becomes acceptable to think about causes propagating in retrograde on a quantum level, it then becomes thinkable that, hey, maybe living systems are capitalizing on this somehow. And boom, when that happens, okay, then maybe you'll see some psychologists daringly start to take seriously the idea of the brain as a quantum computer and able to draw on future information and living systems in general as oriented towards their own survival.
Bingo. I love this idea and the consequences of the idea that somehow this could in some way help us with survival of not just ourselves as individual organisms, but for group survivals of organisms. The gift of something like precognition is so unbelievably vast. I would like to see it happen before something like physics, but I don't even know if that's possible. That to me was one of the most striking things about this whole idea of time loops and of precognitive dreams. I hope you're right, Eric. I hope that, are you calling it 10 years? Maybe 10 years that we'll be able to break out of this strange...
I don't know. I'm not calling it. I think it's going to be a slow process, but I do think it's happening. I mean, and honestly, even though I think the other sciences like psychology and so forth and the humanities are going to sort of require some permission from physics to start thinking in these terms, there's already a lot of thaw in a lot of fields. Jeffrey Kripal, he's given permission to a lot of people in the humanities to start thinking about these topics and start talking about these topics, because it's not that they haven't been thinking about them, but no one has been allowed to talk about them.
Right.
And he's making it permissible for scholars and scientists to talk about their own paranormal experiences. What it's revealing is that, I don't know, our culture has just silenced these things.
Right.
And I think that's ending. And take a topic like UFOs. We're seeing it around a lot of paranormal subjects these days. Obviously, the UFO topic. No longer, do you only see a news story about a UFO sighting, and hear the X-Files theme and have kind of a tone of mild, gentle ridicule. It's a topic taken seriously, and people aren't making fun of it. And that's a big deal.
Yeah.
I like to think it's going to happen with things like precognition and precognitive dreams too. I like to think that my own work is helping in a small way, but I'm not the only writer writing about this stuff. I mean, there are a lot of books coming out about precognition and premonitions, and a lot of people doing really interesting work parallel to the work I'm doing. And I like to think there is kind of a critical mass building of people making it legitimate to talk about psychic phenomena, however you want to interpret those phenomena. I think a lot more people are talking about these kinds of things and doing so openly. Here's an example. I mean, one of the recent New York Times bestsellers is a novel called Homeland Elegies by Ayad Akhtar. And this author talks in the novel about his precognitive dreams. I mean, it's like clearly it's a fictionalized narrator in the book, or slightly fictionalized, but he talks about precognitive dreams. And in an interview on NPR, he openly talked about his precognitive dreams, including a dream about 9/11. It's like, okay, when you can have a mainstream big novelist, talking on NPR about his precognitive dreams, that's not ridiculed or anything like that by the interviewer. Okay, that's, there's a milestone that's been crossed here, and I like to think that there's going to be more of that.
I'd really hope so. I think we all know that dreams are in some way precognitive. I think that there's something. I've yet to meet a person who hasn't had an extraordinary synchronicity, or who has not had a dream that came true later on. Or if they say that they don't, they just haven't searched hard enough. But this brings it to a somewhat individual basis, and I want to wrap it up here with a couple of things. The first one is just from something that you said on a blog post that you had on the Nightshirt. It was called, I believe, Wormholes, Freud, and Jacob the Dreamer. And you end that by basically saying this: "This is our predicament. We are always ignorant of the future that is inflecting us. The only times we aren't is when that future is unavoidable. When we see our behavior at every moment as a compromise of our outcome of efficient causes pushing from our past and refluxing thoughts from our future, deflecting or swerving us, we see ourselves in a different light, and even may get a new philosophical distance on age-old unproductive hang-ups like whether or not we possess free will. In the glass block universe, our field of freedom is not our future. It is our self-creation in and of our own past, the simultaneous discovery and creation of who we always were." Now, I nearly cried when I read that for the first time, because...
Well, you're just going to be sobbing at my new book. That is the new book is sort of taking that idea and expanding it to a book.
Well, I can't wait.
You better bring the Kleenex, boy.
Man. Well, it's just, you are a fantastic writer, and I'm not just saying that. I think we know this. But I want to ask you, having this knowledge, how do you think this changes our lives on an individual basis? Knowing that somehow we are at almost all moments reaching to the future, but bringing the past with us and creating something from that. If we all, every single person on the earth, was able to have this perspective, how do our lives change, and how does the world change, Eric?
It radically intensifies the value of our lives and the value of others' lives to recognize this. I'm glad you asked that, because this is what I've been trying, what I have really struggled to formulate. Because my intuition from the very start, when I started working with precognition, nearly a decade ago, was that God, this radically transforms our sense of who we are. But how can I get that across? And that's why my term, the long self, that I use in the new book is intended to do that. I'm trying to get people to realize, first of all, have these experiences. Because once you start having these experiences, you start to think about your biography as this big, massive, incredibly fascinating and wonderful formation in the universe that's permanent. It's there. It's not, I think we have been habituated to think of ourselves as just who we are in the present moment, right, with a past that's gone to oblivion and a future that couldn't potentially be somehow relevant to who we are now. The thinking of us as long selves totally revises that. You start to hold your dream journal in your hand and realize that, oh my God, my childhood is still in my head right now, and my future, my future self, wherever I'll be in a year, decades, whatever, is in my head now. Those experiences that I'm going to have for the rest of my life are actually already in my head right now. And that I am this four-dimensional structure. I mean, it's a sublime kind of re-experiencing of the self. And it encourages taking yourself seriously. Not, in mysticism, there's kind of two meanings of the self, and there's the kind of the bad meaning of the self that we, in Zen, try to get rid of. Right. I don't mean that self. I mean the self as just the whole of your life. Your life is like this super amazing, precious thing, and it has this coherence and unity to it, like a story. It's just like a novel has foreshadowing. Mm-hmm. Well, guess what? So one of the things that I've been saying a lot, I think I say it in the new book too, is that I would love to see people stop talking in terms of psychology, because I really think that what we are is a biography. I think thinking in terms of our life as biography,
I love it,
as a story that has coherence. So that's part of the answer to your question. And then that makes it sound like a very narcissistic, kind of navel-gazing kind of thing. But when you realize that we're all long selves, right, and our lives are intertwining, woven together in just amazing ways through time, that you are a long self that is utterly sublime and with incredible complexity and dimension. I'll only ever glimpse fragments of that. You realize the value of other people, right, when you realize that we're all long selves. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I try to tell people, precognition is, it's not going to get you rich in the lottery, the horse races or whatever. And it's pretty much a retrospective kind of thing, because you can only study it after an event has come to pass. And then you can examine how your dream, on such and such a date was transformed into, or how the experience you had now was transformed into a certain dream on such and such a date. You can sort of learn about symbolic transformations that are going on in your tesseract brain. We don't think of precognition as this superpower thing that's going to get you rich, and so on. It's a lens onto yourself, onto who you are, and it's a kind of gnosis. Right. Its value is spiritual. Even just discovering a single precognitive dream, I mean, it's kind of like, it's a very blissful experience. But imagine starting to having that experience on a daily basis, and having these, or maybe not daily, but like frequent reminders, right, of your own, that you're a long self. It's particularly profound if, when you start keeping dream journal over years. Fortunately, I had kept a dream journal for decades by the time I was even interested in this topic. Right. And I've been able to identify precognitive dreams that span decades of my life. I mean, if it's mind-boggling that you could dream about an event 2 days from now, right, think how mind-boggling it is to open your dream journal, to have an experience, like a very singular experience in your life, and realize, holy shit, and go back to a dream that you had 2 decades ago, and oh my God, it's right there in your dream journal from decades ago. You dreamed about this moment you're living right now. It's like, that is a mind-blowing experience. And fortunately, I've been working with other dream workers who can testify to this and who shared even more mind-blowing experiences than the ones I've found in my own life. I talk about a few of these in the new book. I mean, there's some that are just utterly mind-blowing, and stories that you just will not believe. If I told you right now, you would not believe them. So there are people, a lot of people keep dream journals and have for decades, and this is a whole new way of reading those dream journals. Believe me, and it's never too late to start.
So the point of your book, Time Loops, the one thing that you say at the very end of the book is everybody needs to start a dream journal, and I've been saying that on this show as well. I've had a dream journal for well over 10 years. Yes, you hit upon it there. These things are stories. It's all seemingly a story, strangely, and perhaps even the universe itself is some kind of story. And that's magic, baby. That's really what it is. Eric, I have to know. So you've got Precognitive Dreamwork and The Long Self. It's coming out next year. It should be out in and around February, March?
Its official publication date is March 9th, but they promised me that it'll probably actually start shipping at the beginning of February or early in February. So yeah, it's available for pre-order right now. So
wonderful.
I'm eager to hear people's reactions, and I'm hoping that it starts a conversation about this topic.
I've already read it, and it's great. I can tell everybody right now that it's already... I'm just kidding. Eric hasn't sent me a copy, but I can tell already that I read it, and I loved it. What's after this, then? You're just going to let this book sit for a little bit before you go on to the next and crush the next realm, or what? What happens, Eric?
No, I've got about 4 books started on my hard drive, but I have no time to write them. It's the problem between very busy day job and kids and all the stresses of life. But I'm hoping to get back to the next one, which will be on creativity and precognition. So this is a topic that I've touched on a lot in my blog over the last couple of years with certain case studies, and a couple of those will actually turn into chapters in the book. But I've got a lot more material, mostly writers and filmmakers who clearly are channeling from their future. Right. I'm arguing that that's what creativity is, essentially. Yeah. It's going to be, I've got some cool stuff in there on some pretty major artists and writers that people would not ordinarily think of as precogs, but who were.
Great. Fantastic. Eric, I love everything you do. I'm always constantly shocked, especially when I go through the Night Shirt and just find an article I haven't read yet, and it's always so wonderful to see. Please continue. I think you were born to write. I think that this is something that you can't stop. You can't stop now, and I hope you know this. And thank you so much for being on this show. Where can people find your work besides heading to places that sell books and the Night Shirt? Do you have other areas in which you publish, or? Not
much. No? I've kind of been lazy about publishing my work in journals that pay and magazines. I got a few pieces here and there, but by and large, my blog and stuff on my blog eventually gets reworked and becomes my books. But usually there's a long time lag there because it's just I don't have the time. But yeah, so those are the places. Hopefully the new book will actually be in bookstores. I'm excited about that. Hopefully people will continue going to bookstores and going to local bookstores and not just big chains. But anyway, that's the idea.
Wonderful.
Of the new book.
So thenightshirt.com, that will be in the show notes for everybody. So I'll have the links to be able to find all of Eric's work and pre-order Eric's book on whatmagicisthis.com, as well as some show notes, which will be pretty interesting, and linking to articles of Eric's that I've really, truly love. Also on whatmagicisthis.com, you'll find a place to subscribe to my podcast, whether it's on iTunes or Spotify. If they have podcasts, I'll be listed, so just search for my podcast. I'll be there. Also on whatmagicisthis.com, you can find links to my Twitter account, to my Instagram account, as well as my Facebook account. I'm friends with Eric on Twitter. He's got a really wonderful Twitter account, and he links to a lot of really interesting articles. If you like the podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or on Stitcher. It would be greatly appreciated. The reviews have been somewhat quiet recently. I don't mind. That's cool. But if you really love the show and you want to say something about it, please leave a nice review for me there. Also, if you enjoy the show, why not tell a friend? Tell a friend, let them know, and perhaps they'll enjoy it and they'll tell a friend. That's how these things get going, right? All right, thanks. Also, I have started a Patreon account. We're doing some really interesting stuff there. I also just recently started a Discord, so if you become a patron, there's a way for you to connect with other strange individuals, such as ourselves there. But I'm also putting up a lot of interesting content. I just recently put up about a 12-minute video about how to make Florida water, which has been very well received. And this isn't just me standing in front of a camera, just talking at the camera. I actually go through the process and I show you every step of how to make Florida water. So if you're interested, please, patreon.com/whatmagicisthis. It's only $7 a month. I don't have any tiers. It's either you support the show or you don't. And $7, that's basically a fancy drink or, I don't know, a bag of beef jerky. So please, the support would be greatly appreciated. I do a ton of work for the podcast, and I hope that it shows, and I hope you're able to support and encourage such a thing as this podcast. If you're not feeling the whole Patreon thing, I also have a PayPal me account on whatmagicisthis.com. Just click the little PayPal icon, and you could donate up to $5 to $10 to $20 to any amount, basically. It all helps, and it all goes to support this show and the work that I do, so that would be greatly appreciated. So all of those things can be found on whatmagicisthis.com. Eric, I would love if perhaps once the new book is published, I would love to chat with you a bit more once I've digested that, but I hope if I was to ask you to come back on the show, you would.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, this has been great.
Thank you so much for joining me, Eric, and I wish you the best of luck, and best of luck with situating yourself in the new area and with the family. So for everybody, that's the end of the program. Come on back to What Magic Is This? We'll talk about a lot more of this weird, crazy, occult, time-loopy, precognitive, crazy, weird shit that you all love and enjoy. Until then, stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay luminous. We'll talk at you soon. Bye-bye.